Hello, welcome back. Today we're discussing the theory and history of writing. But before we do that, I'd like to make one more important point about Marshall McLuhan, following up on last time. If you want to run and get that book, it might be helpful. I'm going to open up to page 18 and 19 and just make one important point that, in a sense, concludes what McLuhan is saying throughout the book. So if I want to begin reading a passage, a very important passage on page 18, this is in the penultimate paragraph, about halfway through, about 5 lines up in that paragraph. Sentence begins with the effects of technology. And McLuhan writes, "The effects of technology do not occur at the level of opinions or concepts." And in this case, he's talking about larger technologies, of mechanical technologies and electronic technologies. But we can think of that in terms of the technology of writing. The effects of technology do not occur at the level of opinions or concepts, but alter sense ratios or patterns of perception steadily and without any assistance. The serious artist is the only person able to encounter technology with impunity, just because he is an expert aware of the changes in sense perception. McLuhan continues on page 19, on the top of the page, at the end of that paragraph, to say that a change in technology is a change in our sense lives, It's a change in how we sense ourselves in the world. So the degree to which we feel ourselves becoming, in his language, as he says at the end of that paragraph, extended in some way. Differences in the way that we feel ourselves extended in the world. He says there's change in an extension of our sense lives. This change does not depend upon approval or disapproval of those living in society. So if we go back to the beginning of that, of what I just read on page 18, the point here is that it's not up to us as individuals. That is to say, how we judge a changing technology has nothing to do with how we will sense the world in which we live that uses that technology. So when he says the effects of technology do not occur at the levels of opinions or concepts, concepts is the key word there, but at the level of, key word in the next clause there, perception, he means to say we can judge however we please, but when we live in a world that uses a certain kind of technology, our very world is different, and we therefore sense ourselves, and we sense ourselves within that world differently than we might have or did, in fact, before the introduction of the new technology. So a very simple, in other words, we don't really have control over this as individuals. So, for example, and we'll be talking about this when we get to Ong in just a minute, a world in which writing exists is simply a different world from a world in which there is no writing. And even if you do not know how to read and write, you have a sense of a world that is quite different from a sense of a world in which there is no writing. You know that there is writing around you. You know that it communicates something. You may not know what it communicates, but you know that it communicates something. You are aware that writing dictates certain laws and tells you certain rules and expresses certain ideas or is capable of telling certain stories. And though you do not have access to this in a certain way, you're part of a world in which this is important and which changes your sense of yourself within that world. Another simple example is the sort of sense which, we have landlines, telephone landlines are becoming very expensive because they're becoming obsolete. Most of us use cell phones or we use computers and so on to communicate with one another. So landlines are becoming less available in a certain sense because there are fewer of them. And we can judge however we like the sort of high cost of these phones and things like that. But we can't really do anything about it. And our sense of the world is in some way changing. So let me think of one more example here. We could say that if you want to buy something online, you can't use cash. You can use PayPal, you can use a credit card, and so on. I could judge if I like that this is a bad thing. I could choose not to participate, but the world is different, and my sense of my place within that world is somehow different. I'm excluded in a way from participating in that sort of culture. And these are somewhat weak examples in a way, but you'll see more what I mean when we get to discussing Ong. But your very sense of the world is different. So it's not a judgment. So when I think of people resisting technological changes, saying, for example, that they won't participate in X, Y, or Z, eventually, as the history of writing will show us, the technologies change the world in such a way that your sense of it simply is different. It doesn't matter how you judge it or how you think of it. Your very sense of the world is different in ways that you probably are not fully aware of or necessarily being reflective about. So we'll continue with that. And his claim here, or McLuhan's claim here, is that the artist is the person who is able to step outside and try to capture those perceptions, those changed perceptions, to try to give us a way of understanding the newly perceived world in which we find ourselves. And it's an interesting definition of what the artist is capable of doing. But the artist, generally speaking, could be anybody who's able to step outside and sort of get a grasp or kind of communicate or understand or be reflective about the differently perceived world. And it's not easy to do. And we'll see why when we look to the ways that scholars deciphering ancient scripts and ancient texts and so on were blocked precisely by perceptions of the world, their perceptions of the world that they had not yet become reflective about. So we'll see that very shortly. So if we look then to today's topic, the theory and history of writing, I'm referring or using 3 different texts here, so you might hear me flipping about a little bit. There's an awful lot to say about this, and I am summarizing what are some generally held views, a somewhat consensus about the theory and history of writing, as we find it since the beginning of the first writing systems in, as I'll focus in this course, ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. There were other writing systems, early writing systems. We'll be getting back to Chinese. We won't be getting to everything, but we'll see the basics. And what's interesting is that writing systems around the world developed roughly at the same time in history, roughly around 32 to 3500 BC. And they developed in, again, roughly the same way, which is kind of amazing. There's much debate as to whether there was communication among these different cultures originating these systems. But they did, there is some, anyway, there's debate about that. Some people say that there was some communication, others say that there could not have been. Regardless, these systems originated, again, roughly between 3200 and 3500 BC, all around the world. So I want to say first a few things about what writing is. And I'm drawing largely for these comments from the text that we've read for today. So if we look to, and here you'll begin to hear me flipping around a little bit. I apologize if there's any noise or rustling or distraction as a result. But what does writing do, or what is it primarily as a thing? Writing is a technology or a tool for, and this is in the words of Ong and Ganaskian, translating time into space at the most basic level, this is what writing is. It's a way of translating time into space or expressing time in space. Ong puts it, the commitment of the word to space. So writing takes up space, literally. Oral speech, speaking, does not take up space. It quite literally does not take up space. This is kind of fascinating conceptually if you just think about it. So speech occurs in time. I say something, and as I'm saying something, it happens and it disappears. So it moves in time. It is not committed to space. It is not made permanent in any way. It's temporal. So speech is by definition a temporal medium, and writing is a spatial one. Again, by definition, we see it. It's something that we see, and it's something that we commit to space. It's really kind of a fascinating idea. Next thing that I'd like to, and we'll be going into this in greater detail. So writing makes things then, by putting them into space, makes them, at least in theory, permanent. So putting something into space makes it into an object. It makes it something separate from, or ourselves certainly, and also something that can live on its own. So Ong calls writing a kind of autonomous discourse. It's separate. It has a life of its own. It's autonomous. We'll be talking about this further because there are some disclaimers we need to describe there, but generally speaking, writing is autonomous. It's out there, it's an object in the world, separate from anything that we say, and not necessarily needing to be connected to anything that we say, at least not directly. So we create these written objects, and we write something, period, and we've made an object of something that we've thought about or something that we could maybe perhaps say. So this is what writing essentially does. And we want to then talk about a little more practically how we put the word into space. Well, we put the word into space by means of scripts. And this is discussed in all of the reading for today, but is primarily the focus of the story of writing. We come up with scripts. We come up with written systems put into space, systems that we can see, that in some way represent spoken language, in some way. And I want to be very careful to say that. I won't keep reiterating that, but keep in mind that there is no such thing as a direct translation, or a direct transcription, rather, of what we say. This is not possible. But writing is, roughly speaking, a representation of what was said. A very concrete example given in the reading for today is that of stenography, of writing down what's said in a court, getting a transcript of what happens in a courtroom on a particular day. Not literally everything that is said is written down. There's not a literal transcription of every bit of a speech, of every bit of the spoken word. There's a representation of what was said. So scripts give us representations, and they give us, in different degrees, less or more accurate translations or transcriptions of what was said. So if we look to page 14 in the story of writing, you'll see a little bit what I mean. And this is a very, very important page to continue to go back to. So if I want to read a little bit and explain what some of this means. And again, page 14 is discussed in greater length, or the concepts on page 14, in much greater detail in Ong and Gnadsky, to which we'll turn in just a minute. So on page 14, all scripts that are full writing, that is to say, that try to communicate in some way or represent something that was said, operate on the basic principle contrary to what most people think, some scholars included. I'm skipping a little bit. All writing systems use a mixture of phonetic and semantic sounds. I'll explain what that means. So a semantic sound is what we might, a semantic sign rather, is what is called differently, but roughly meaning the same things. Pictographs or logograms, you've seen this language in the reading, sometimes called ideographs. These are not exactly the same thing, but they're roughly the same thing. And the idea is that a picture has a meaning, and that meaning is immediately clear when we look at the picture. So we could draw a picture of a woman, and we know that it's a woman. Now, that's a semantic sign. It has meaning. It communicates meaning. And for a long time, and we'll be getting into this, scholars and many people today who don't study language terribly closely would think that, this is actually the case, that a picture simply says one thing, and it says it clearly or communicates an idea clearly. Well, that's what we would call, or that idea actually, which is in fact a myth, and I'll explain that in a minute, is what we would call pure logography, which is on the bottom of page 14. Pure logography shows this idea that a picture immediately and purely translates an idea, and we know exactly, therefore, what to say. Now, if you think about this quite simply, the word a picture of a woman could call up any number of different pronunciations, especially depending on how we draw that picture, right? We could draw a picture of, it could mean female, it could mean little girl, it could mean grown woman, it could mean any number of things. And this is precisely the point, that these original pictographs, these original semantic signs that had some sort of meaning, never in fact were purely delivering one meaning. Never. This didn't happen. And so there's no such thing as pure logography. Now, did they, generally speaking, communicate a semantic category? Yes. So we'll look at that. There's this idea still, I think, among many folks that a Chinese character communicates one idea clearly, and it simply doesn't. So we'll be talking about that. So a semantic sign can mean a number of different things. More importantly, or rather moreover, the semantic sign can be, as you saw in the different translations that I just uttered for this picture of a woman, female, little girl, and so on, they can also make different sounds. I literally made different sounds, but they can also be used phonetically. These signs themselves can be used phonetically. So we have to talk about what it means to use a sign phonetically. A phonetic sign has a sound. It has a sound that, for the most part, does not change. Our alphabet, the Roman alphabet that we use when we're writing English, is, roughly speaking, phonetic. So we look at a letter and it makes a sound, and it consistently makes that sound. Now, many of you, as I was just saying that, probably thought, well, many of our sounds, many of our letters tend to make different sounds depending on the word in which they appear, and that's exactly true. If you look on this screen, you can see the word writing itself, WR. Why do we need that W? Why do we know that that's not a phonetic pronunciation that we're looking at? Why do we not say hua, r? Why do we not say that? It's because no language is, or ever can be, purely phonetic. It's impossible. We'll talk about why shortly. But the idea, or the goal, as is stated at the end of the chapter in the story of writing, when there is a brief summary of Leibniz's goal for written forms, is to find what's called on page 14, a script that is purely phonetic. If you look at the bottom of the chart, on the other side to the opposite end of pure logography, we have pure phonography. So this really pure script, this pure writing form that can perfectly translate sounds and do so consistently. This is impossible, and we'll talk about why again as we continue. But any language, the important point that is made here on this page, any written form, not language, I shouldn't keep saying that word, written form of a language, a written representation of a language, falls somewhere between pure phonography and pure logography. Any written form of a language uses a combination, as we go, of semantic signs and phonetic signs. And many semantic signs can have different pronunciations. They can have different phonetic associated with them. They can sound differently, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So if we continue to read a little bit, what differs in the middle of page 14, what differs apart from the outward form of the symbols, of course, is the proportion of phonetic to semantic signs. That's what differentiates, in one way, the written forms of various languages. The higher the proportion of phonetic signs, the easier it is to guess the pronunciation of the word. So it's easier to know that a picture of a woman, the word woman, W-O-M-A-N, says woman, than to look at a picture of a woman. It's much more easily comprehensible. So if we look to the chart again at the bottom of page 14, Chinese is certainly closer toward pure logography. And English is certainly closer to pure phonography, but there's no such written form of a language that can be purely either. So to clarify or to follow up on one assumption I've been making as I've been talking about this that is described very fully in the reading for today, remember that a language is not the written form of the language. Language is spoken. Language, and again, I'm just drawing from the reading, language is, in some ways, if we grow up around a group of people, learned, for the most part, naturally. We will learn language unless there's something prohibiting us from doing so. We will learn language. We will learn how to speak our native language if we are surrounded by others who speak that language, and if we're surrounded by them continuously, or more or less continuously. We will not learn the written expression, the written form of our language, unless we study it, unless we learn it. This is because writing is a technology. It is not organic. It is not natural to us. It can come to seem natural, as I said in the introduction to this course, but it is not in fact natural. And again, confronting a new writing system makes clear why that is. So, writing is, again, an expression or a representation, in a rough way at least, of what we say. And the script form, the scripts, the written forms that we use to write, one written form can be used to write a number of different languages, which proves this point. So, for example, we, when we're writing English, use the Roman alphabet. That is the script that we use. The Roman alphabet is used for any number of other languages. Small changes are made to the script, but roughly speaking, the Roman alphabet is used to write French, Spanish, German, again with a few changes, and so on, Portuguese, okay? So the script is used to write a number of different languages. That is the way, again, in which writing is distinct from or separate from what we say. Now, one last point that I will make right now before we go on to discuss some of the details of how script works and writing works and how it came to be, is to say that, and this is from Ong, and you'll hear me shuffling a bit here, looking for my page. This is from Ong on page 8 in the book. If you go to the second paragraph, I'm going to read roughly from the beginning of the second paragraph. All right, in the second sentence, written texts all have to be related somehow, directly or indirectly, to the world of sound, the natural habitat of language, to yield their meanings. The world of sound is this world of speaking, this language that we learn naturally, or that comes to us naturally, again, if we're surrounded by others who speak our language when we're growing up. So the world of sound, that natural habitat. Remember, writing is not natural. Writing is a technology that we learn. Language is natural. To continue with this page, reading on this paragraph, reading a text means converting it to sound. We are always doing this. We don't necessarily do this out loud, but there's a reason that when we don't understand something, we tend to want to read it aloud. Reading a text means converting it to sound, aloud or in the imagination. There's the key. We're doing this when we read, syllable by syllable in slow reading, or sketchily in the rapid reading common to high technology cultures. The important point is in the next sentence. Writing can never dispense with orality. So the point here and what we'll be discussing in this course is that script, written forms, representations of language are never purely autonomous. Writing is never purely out there on its own. To be understood, it depends on orality. It depends on the spoken word. Not completely, but it needs that. And we're going to be talking about what that means. Really simply put, we need an active reader of that writing who understands the context for the writing and who understands where and how to fill in the gaps. So we'll see this when we much more easily when we look at some of the ancient writing systems, but we're always filling something in. We may not be aware of it, but we're always filling something in. There's always something that we know about our spoken language and the context in which a piece of writing appears that helps us to interpret or actually read literally, just read literally what's on the page. So to give you an example of how this happens all the time, yet in ways that we might not be aware of, if you can look at Gdańskian page, and again I'm flipping a little bit, if you look to page 9, I'm going to read a bit from page 9 to explain how we're always filling in, we're always providing missing information when we're reading something, even if we don't realize it. And I don't mean at the level of a fancy interpretation or even any interpretation. I'm talking about simply filling in some of the basics so that we can come up with a literal meaning. So if you look at page 9, I'm going to read this full paragraph and then explain it. There are many variations in sound. This is the third paragraph on page 9. There are many such variations in sound that the native speakers of a language disregard and typically have lost the ability to hear unless they have training in phonetics. What change is this? What variation is this that we don't hear? If you look to the previous paragraph, you'll see the letter P used in two different words, spoof and poof. That letter P is being pronounced differently in both of those words when we say it out loud. Spoof and poof, those are different sounds. Those are actually different sounds. Now, we don't necessarily register that sound, but we know what to say, or we're forced to say it by the script in a certain way. So we're always filling something in, right? As we move toward purely logographics systems, again, which don't actually exist, but more logographic systems, we're required to fill in more, and more depends on orality. More depends on an actual speaker bringing language to the written form. But in this case, what the letters can do with this example of spoof and poof is roughly represent the sound that we say. Roughly represents it. Doesn't perfectly represent it, but represents it roughly and well enough so that we hardly notice a difference. This is what's explained. This is what we call a phoneme. A phoneme, which is, as we say in the, which will be defined in the next paragraph. There are many variations in sound, such as a spoof poof, that native speakers of a language disregard and typically have lost the ability to hear unless they have training in phonetics. We just don't hear it. We don't register it. Native speakers of a given language will consider an entire range of sounds, an entire range, a whole range of different variations on the p sound, to be, quote, the same. That same sound, quote, same sound that native speakers perceive is called by linguists a phoneme of that language. So most languages, and all of them in fact, use phonemes. Ours does as well. We continue. The actual sounds of a language are infinitely varied. There are many, many more sounds that we say that we don't necessarily register. The actual sounds, they are uttered by different people in different circumstances. It would be pointless to try to capture this variation in writing. This is precisely why we can never have a purely phonetic language. It's pointless to try to capture this variation in writing. We're always supplying the orality, the spoken form, to what we are reading. Most languages have between 20 and 37 phonemes, and phonemes can be written down. An alphabet that is strictly phonemic would have the same number of letters as phonemes. Okay? So we would have all of the letters we needed to represent every variation of this P sound. Right? We do have, which is in the back of the Ganatskian book, we do have what's called the International Phonetic Alphabet, which is discussed on page 11, which tries roughly to give a larger range, a larger script to represent more spoken sounds. So you can take a look at that. It's useful for transliterating languages, and what that means is for finding, and this is very important for understanding writing, for finding ways to write down using another script and original language. So for example, Greek, when we look at that, which we'll be looking at shortly, no longer has is not written with the Roman alphabet, but we can transliterate it or take the word and put it in the Roman alphabet. So the word Nike, the word Nike is not, if you looked at it, you would not be able to read it if you were looking for an Nike, something like that, Nike. It would look different. And so we can transliterate those sounds, though. And we'll be talking about this in great detail with a number of examples when we talk about hieroglyphics and cuneiform. So hang on for that. A few more points that I want to make before I go on to part 2 of this introduction, which will be in a second audio, are the reasons for the appearance of writing, just very roughly. And then some conclusions that have been made about writing itself. So the reasons, generally speaking, that are agreed upon for writing having originated roughly 3,500 in roughly 3,200 BC are these. There's just simply 3. Most people generally agree that writing arose from accountancy, that is to say, from a desire to keep track of things, not from a desire to record speech, but from a desire to keep track of things, so literally for storage keeping or information gathering or counting. And it emerged in different ways, and we understand this to different degrees in the various writing systems that originated about 5,000 years ago. So generally, people agree that that is how it originated, and we'll talk about the details of that later. And that it was used originally and over the course of the thousands of years of its development toward fuller scripts for government purposes, for rule, right? That's the first reason, or first use. For, as I've already said, record keeping, but more elaborate record keeping. and for religion, which is very important. So for government, for rule, for record keeping, administration, business, and so on, and for religion. And we'll be talking about that more fully shortly. The next set of points that I'd like to make are simply introductory, just summarizing a bit of what we've read. So these are largely from the story of writing, but summarizes much of what I've said today and also what is said in the 3 sets of readings for today. So a number of points just to keep in mind. Number 1 is what I've just said, that it's generally agreed that writing began in accountancy, in a desire to keep track of things, not in a desire to translate the spoken word into a written form. That came later. Second point is that writing as a technology is understood, and we can debate this, but to be amoral. It is neither good nor bad. It serves a purpose. It extends us in some way, and we'll be talking about the various ways in which writing extends our sense of ourselves in the world when we look at practical examples from the different systems and from the different cultures who use these systems. So writing is amoral. It is neither good nor bad. You can think about that. Third point, which I've already mentioned, is that writing seems to have begun simultaneously in the various places around the world in which it originated, simultaneously, which is kind of fascinating. And there's debate as to whether there was communication among these cultures coming up with writing or not. And fourth, and I've discussed this in detail, but remember this, all scripts are to some degree logographic and phonetic. All scripts are to some degree using pictures or semantic signs and phonetic signs. So keep that in mind. It's very important. And if you look to page, just to close this introduction for today, if you look to page, this is 17 in the story of writing, we'll see a subtitle called Modern Hieroglyphs, right? The author here of this book is questioning or wondering whether, in fact, today we are returning to more ideographic or logographic writing. That the dream that we had, especially since the Enlightenment, but much earlier than that, we're going to see how the alphabet came to be, the Roman alphabet came to be. But this dream of a language that purely represents sound, or I shouldn't say language. You should always hear me and have that in mind. I should say writing, a written expression, a written representation of a language. This dream of having a purely phonetic writing system or way to write that represents sound is in fact a dream that can never be realized. And the author of this book, and what I'd like us to think about in this course, is whether and the degree to which writing is returning to or becoming, at least in our own language, in English, in the written form of English, is becoming less alphabetic and perhaps more logographic, less phonetic and more logographic in some limited ways. So just a brief example, if we look to page 17, there are a number of pictures along the side of the page. And I do think with the rise of the internet and with the rise of all of these overlaps of different kinds of visual communication with written scripts, that we are moving in some way, toward more pictographic forms of expression again. And which is not to suggest that we're returning to a more purely logographic language or moving sort of drastically toward that. But there is a way in which, when one uses the internet, one has to engage with, I think, pictures, semantic signs, in a way that has not been demanded of us, probably even in the middle of the 20th century. There's a kind of new demand on our attention and a new, perhaps changing sense for us of what it means to read and to write, that have nothing to do, again, with, as McLuhan puts it, our judgment, but that are changing our sense perception and what we're actually required to do. So just think about this, and thank you, and we'll move on to the second part of this introduction.